Depending on who you ask, certainly in some small circles in the modern world, there is still some uncertainties about the shape of the Earth. I know that for most people it is utterly irrational to question the shape of the Earth. There is a growing worldwide synergy as to what the shape of the Earth is, and there are many advantages to this growing belief synergy, but there are also some serious detriments as well. I would like to discuss some of this in this video, and I would also like to reveal a whole new way of seeing the Earth, the shape of the Earth, and the shape of space and time. But before we get there, we could say that a very small minority does still question the accepted truth of the times, that the Earth is a perfect sphere, floating peacefully in the middle of blackness, like a perfect giant flying bowling ball. We can begin then by saying that there is a debate of sorts, which in the end is no debate really, being that fewer and fewer people question the beliefs of the times, but there are a rebellious few, let us say, that question the accepted beliefs about the shape of the Earth. Most believe that the Earth is a hard, perfectly round object, very much like the moon that can be seen out there in outer space as you look up at the sky, and to question the shape of things, the shape of the Earth, is insanity, period. But in a loose sense, still, thankfully, you could say that there has been this debate of sorts, a very heated argument depending on where you look, between those that would say that the Earth is a perfect sphere, and those that continue to disagree with these notions and insist that the Earth is perhaps flat, or something not so perfectly round at the very least. And the important point, in particular as it pertains to this video, is whether it is possible that the Earth is something more than just the perfect round hard sphere, a different shape altogether perhaps, beyond round or flat, something completely unexpected, having to do with cosmological laws that are just beginning to be understood. And if so, if this is possible in some insane worldview, then what advantages could there be to this kind of knowing beyond the sticks and stones rationality of the times? And if such an alternate shaping, is possible, could it be that certain groups, secret houses, occult orders, have been aware of this knowing for a very long time, and that they have been using this knowledge as power to do what some now think is impossible, to travel beyond this Earth in highly irrational ways? This is what I wish to share with you in this video. But to begin, in this video, we could start with this small debate between flat and round. For those that argue against the flat Earth theory, it is absolutely absurd to think of the Earth as anything but the sphere that is described and rendered by modern technological ability and understanding. Such a notion as a flat Earth is so crazy to many people that they would not even be able to consider anyone who thinks such things to be sane. And with that, we must always lead with the idea of what insanity is really, at least in certain cases, which is something I have discussed in the past, which is the idea that insanity, like the emperor's new clothes, is in the end, to some degree anyway, at times and in the best of terms, a matter of countering mass belief, and as such, inner alchemists are in that sense never, hardly ever, within the range of the mass beliefs of the human world, because they have developed perceptive mechanisms, and ways to move perceptive points, that make their perceptions highly unique. So, in that sense then, being that they do not see the emperor's new clothes, inner alchemists are in that sense insane in accordance with such definitions, and there are some great advantages to such insanity. There are a number of videos that I have done in the past talking about dogmatic knowledge, and about the problems with assumption, and all of this basically boils down to the general acceptance of the majority of the population, that is, whatever is said by certain authority groups is true, must be true, that it is a truth beyond questioning just because certain authority groups said so. In other words, dogmatic belief, in accordance with inner alchemy, is a kind of faith-based belief. It is unquestioned belief accepted only because authority figures claim that such things are so, and they have the right to claim that it is so because of certain inalienable rights that are themselves sometimes questionable. There are certainly those that truly experiment, calculate, and seek, but there is also a large percentage that accepts, without question. There are two groups in a sense, those that accept dogmatic or second-hand knowledge, and those that seek to know for themselves in one way or another, whether that is through their own experimentation and science, or through other occult means, to discover the truth for themselves. Inner alchemists are those that always choose to know directly, to perceive for themselves and accept nothing on faith alone. Being that I am an inner alchemist, my personal thoughts on this have always been that if you are willing to experiment and question, to seek and to calculate for yourself in accordance with your own techniques or the accepted modern technological principles, scientific principles, the accepted principles of the times, then in a sense you are trying to free yourself of dogma, and this is a good thing. If you are not just accepting something as dogmatic truth and leaving it at that, but you are actually going out there and trying to prove or disprove those dogmatic truths, then you are following the way of the individual and potentially the maverick, which is in accordance with my wave, a good sober intent. In accordance with those beliefs held by some, including inner alchemists, the problem arises when we are not willing to question and try to figure things out for ourselves, but instead just accept things as being true or not true because authorities or larger masses of people believe such a thing is so, or not so. And even more dangerous to individual development is the need by some to make others believe what they believe. And this is a real problem for those that want to know their own truth, for themselves. I have called this problem the memetic war, and I describe it in detail in the book, Overcoming the Archon Through Alchemy. Indeed, the first chapter of that book will give you a pretty precise idea of what I am talking about here, and this first chapter is presented using modern terms, using modern language and modern principles, more precisely, attempting anyway, to use the modern science of memetics to explain the nature of this endless hidden war. With the above in mind, the point of this video is not to try to convince anyone of anything. It is instead my desire to provide a different understanding of space and time, in accordance with the seeing of inner alchemy. And I do so in order to try to help with the growing problem of distant space travel, which is a problem that is being faced as the rational world looks out into the infinite cosmos, the vast distances of that cosmos, and desperately tries to figure out ways to move across that vastness using sticks and stones methodologies, that in the end will limit the whole of our race. A limiter that in the end will never be overcome until we can let go of certain hard as stone assumptions and current rational conceptions, and begin to embrace individual ideas, maverick ideas, possibly even truly contemplating what might seem like insane ideas about the true nature of motion. There is of course always developing ideas in science and in the modern world. Indeed, there is a quickening of technology, which I have discussed to some extent in the video, Are We Done Evolving?, which I will link below if you are interested in watching it. But this quickening can sometimes be slowed down quite a lot due to dogmatic beliefs and memetic wars, and my desire in presenting the inner alchemist's perceptive point on space and time is to be able to give another perspective, that even in the smallest way hopefully, can help by providing another perceptive point for others, an energetic perceptive point, that some might find quite challenging, perhaps worth exploring, that may even provide certain answers as to why certain things that are considered to be unreal, and occult, might be possible. Certainly, it is my hope that in presenting this knowledge, you will be challenged with the possibility of discovering your own truth, beyond this dogma, my dogma, so that you discover new ways to perceive using techniques from another era, a forgotten history, and in that way by challenging these notions that I am presenting in this video here, you might find your own way, a way beyond a flat or spherical earth, and align yourself with new and hitherto unsuspected possibilities. How do inner alchemists arrive at their individual truth? Well, they use a technique that may be called seeing, and they also use the technique of projection, which is akin to astral travel, and in that way see and do for themselves alone, as an individual, and as such they stand firm in that knowing, and further they claim that knowing is power, turning that knowing into power by using that knowing to gain greater freedom. They turn that knowledge into power by learning to fly into that vast cosmos for themselves. So, using that kind of seeing I discover my own truth, and using such techniques any individual can discover theirs. They can prove me right or wrong through their own seeing and inner motion. They can develop their own worldview, their own version of direct knowing, no matter what such energetic truths end up being for them, being that even though energetic truth is unchanging, it does and can be given light by each individual in their own highly specific way. In this particular case, in accordance with the seeing of my current of inner alchemy, the earth is neither a sphere nor is it flat, but instead it is more akin to what you might think of as a raindrop, as it falls from some great height. And, as I will do my best to try to explain, the earth and all of the other planets in the solar system are doorways. They are doorways like an infinitude of tunnels that lead to other worlds, each sparkling in the night sky like intensity doorways to new worlds, and all these worlds are separated by a boundless relative nothing, referred to as outer space. To try to explain all of this, imagine a raindrop falling from the sky, and as it falls, because of the surface tension of the liquid, it takes on a sphere-like shape of relative dimensions, as it is buffeted by the winds and other raindrops falling from the sky. If you can imaginatively think of yourself as getting closer and closer to this raindrop, you might also imaginatively see this raindrop getting bigger and bigger the closer that you get to it. As you get closer, you will be able to see that within the surface tension of the raindrop, that is inside that raindrop, there is an entire world. What I mean by this is that, as you imaginatively get closer, and this raindrop gets bigger and bigger, you are able to see hundreds of little creatures existing inside that raindrop, contained within it, sort of like a whole world of creatures existing inside a snow globe-like world. The only thing separating that perfectly encased and contained world is that liquid surface tension, that takes on a relative spherical shape as it free falls from the sky down to the ground below. But during that magical time as it falls, its lifetime, there is a perfect little world contained within what appears to be a spherical object. The Earth, and all the worlds, planets, within the solar system are like this to the seeing of the inner alchemist. They are worlds contained within the precarious surface tension of a raindrop. As you get closer and closer to that raindrop, and as it gets bigger and bigger before you, you will eventually get to a point where the outside air and the water that makes up that raindrop meet. In order to keep going into the raindrop, you must push your way through this outer membrane, and again, because of that surface tension and the relative volume density changes from air to water, that separation between fluid and non-fluid, well, pushing into this membrane is not an easy task. But once inside, that is, once you are able to push through, you would in this imaginative journey, be instantly amazed at how you seem to go through some kind of doorway, as you are able to push through this membrane, a doorway that opens up a whole new world, a world that is no longer some outer sphere, but is in this inside, a whole new world, a contained place in and of itself, seemingly functioning in accordance to laws that are different than what was possible when you were outside. A world that can seemingly stretch in many directions forever, so in that sense this inner world is not a sphere once you are within it, it is now, or has now the possibility, of stretching endlessly in many directions, that in the end from the perceiver's point of view, makes this inside world not really a sphere, but a kind of world full of straight lines where each straight line could theoretically seem to go on forever. Another way to think of this would be to say that outside of the raindrop, outside of this world, you see a world, a raindrop, that is concave, spherical. But once inside that world, as you look out into space from within it, from inside your snow globe, you can, if you perceive it in a correct way from within that world, look out into outer space, out into the space outside the raindrop, and that outside does have the possibility to seem convex in a kind of way, in that there is the possibility for the space existing without that world, to concave within itself, so that from within your world, outer space then becomes the snow globe. In this way, for you, straight lines within the world are possible, and in that sense then, outer space from within that world becomes convex, can in certain circumstances, with the proper laws in place, become convex. That is, outer space, beyond the raindrop becomes a sphere, can be a sphere. And in that sense and from that perceptive notion, within the raindrop world there is the possibility of straight lines in relation to the size of the perceiver, endless straight lines, the feeling of a flat earth in a sense, or kind of flat earth, because that warpedness, the warping of that world due to its fluidity and the mass of that fluid that surrounds it, its curvature due to that surface tension, let's say, which is akin to a kind of gravity, warps perception and can even warp the mechanical laws within that world, and in that way can turn outer space into a sphere. It can create concave and convex, with equal ease in a sense. This is a difficult thing to try to put into words. You could say that the convexness and the concaveness of this fluid bubble are almost interchangeable in a way. Now, I know that in accordance with modern understanding, you are in a globe no matter how straight it might seem while you are in it, being that if you were theoretically in some kind of super-fast airplane, or boat, you would eventually start at one end and meet that same place after you circle the entire planet. According to inner alchemy, such a notion is faulty in some ways in that within the raindrop, that is once you are able to get past that surface tension of a new world, as you enter the distortion bubble boundary of this world, what is within the raindrop has the potential of endless horizons. This is a very difficult topic to explain simply, but it has to do with the potential of any one world, any raindrop, to hold within it other worlds, other raindrops, so that within a raindrop there can be raindrops within raindrops, and each one of those raindrops can lead to different worlds, different dimensions, and each one of these dimensions has the possibility of an expanded inner space that belies the size of the outer diameter of the raindrop, as perceived by someone outside. In other words, a raindrop can be far bigger on the inside than it seems to be on the outside. And due to the interchangeability of the convexness and the concaveness within certain worlds of relatively high mass, there also exists the possibility of warping space within the mass, so that there is this possibility of endless straight lines within such warping, whether in the end such lines are straight or not, being that straight lines are in a sense an illusion in the warp world that I am trying to describe to you here. To explain this further, you can think of the raindrop and the surface tension created by the water as sort of like a warp field, a warp bubble. So that instead of having a liquid, and that liquid representing a certain substance like water, instead you can think of the raindrop as being made up of a kind of gravitational weight, a kind of gravitational consistency, and this consistency may seem liquid-like, but is in fact a gravitational weight, a gravitational thickness, and that thickness holds within it a contained space that is encircled by that certain gravitational consistency. Moreover, within each gravitational consistency bubble, warp bubble, there can be other gravitational bubbles within those bubbles. That is, there can be warp bubbles within warp bubbles, so that looking at the raindrop from the outside you might see curves, but while inside the raindrop you may see straight lines, or angular lines that have a wholly different set of ruling principles, in accordance with the kind of consistency within the warp bubbles. There are those laws that exist outside of the bubble, and then there are laws that exist inside the bubble. Moreover, there always exists the possibility of having warp bubbles within warp bubbles. From outside of the warp bubble, things seem spherical as you look at them from a distance. The closer that you get to the warp bubble, the bigger that the bubble seems to become. Once you break through the membrane of the warp bubble, which as I have said is no easy task, you enter a contained world, contained by that warp bubble, and within that world the laws within it are different than the laws outside of it. From without the bubble, everything within the bubble looks like a sphere. From within the bubble, everything outside the sphere also looks like a sphere, and moreover, that outer sphere that is the world beyond the bubble, can be made bigger or smaller depending on the laws inherent within the warp bubble, being that every contained warp world has slightly different gravitational laws. That makes it seem like within the bubble there are straight lines, even though outside of the bubble, such lines might seem to be curved. Moreover, because of the fact that there can be warp bubbles within warp bubbles, there is the possibility of endless and vast inner worlds within that one warp bubble. In other words, within that warp bubble, to those inside that warp bubble, their world, their earth, could indeed be flat, or that is have certain laws that make it seem like it is quite flat. There might also be doorways within that bubble, other warp bubbles, that then act like tunnels into other worlds, complete other worlds that might be vast in proportion in accordance to the different surface tensions possible within those warp bubbles within warp bubbles, that would then make that one seemingly small bubble from the outside seem to be endless if you are able to go within that bubble, and then within the bubbles within the bubble. So, in accordance with the seeing of inner alchemists, being that we exist within a warp bubble, in that all the worlds within the solar system are in essence warp bubbles, our Earth or any one of those other warp bubbles, those other planets in our solar system, are neither spherical nor flat, they are instead whatever the perceiver perceives in accordance to their location in spacetime, more specifically whether they are within or without the warp bubble. Moreover, being that whether you are inside or outside the raindrop, there can be an interchange between concave and convex, the relative measure of size within or without the warp bubble, at least in accordance with the perceptions of the perceiver in accordance with their position in spacetime, being inside or outside, concave or convex, can at times seem almost inconsequential. In the end, all that really matters is the ability to control warp fields. Each world therefore is a door, each world is a warp bubble. To get from one warp bubble to the other, you seem to need to go through a medium called open space, outer space, which is an area that is devoid of the kind of intensity warp bubbles, the kind of surface tensions, that make up each separate world, so that this open space might not be completely lacking in warp waves, gravitational intensities, but it nevertheless does not have the intensity to be found around each world. It is a relatively warp-free zone, a gray zone in a way, between warp bubbles. In order to access each world, each planet, a traveler, in accordance to how the modern world sees space travel, they would need to break past their particular world containment bubble, move across this gray zone, and then enter a new warp bubble that then represents a whole new world. And within that world, new laws are applicable in accordance with the intensity of the containment warp bubble of that world, and in accordance with the number of warp bubbles existing within that warp bubble, with each particular planet having different kinds of warp bubbles within their warp bubble, and different liquid volumes in a way, which contributes or gives rise to the general nature of how they perceive concave and convex, with a thicker liquid, creating more curvature. What this means is that the thicker the gravitational mass that surrounds any planet, which relates to size, which has nothing to do with largeness in accordance with the seeing of inner alchemists, but instead has to do with gravitational intensity, mass density, which for us relates to time, so this gravitational mass or intensity then dictates how much curvature can be seen inside and outside of that world. Why is this so important? Why must we know about this, and why is it that we are just beginning to discover the notion of warp bubbles after having known about such things in the unrecorded ancient past? As I have mentioned on many occasions, humanity is lost in objective reality, that is, they can only see the world as a static thing full of objects. Humanity on a mass level does not see energy, the human world can only see objects. Therefore, they do not see warp bubbles like inner alchemists, instead they see solid, hard, round objects all floating in space, and as such they have a difficult time reconciling the nature of distance, size, intensity and frequency. In accordance with the direct perceptions of inner alchemists, the world is not round or flat per se, it is instead a warp bubble that has the possibility of attaining many shapes, not just round and flat. Such static ideas about the nature of our world or any other have everything to do with the human inability to see things beyond just physical objects. For an inner alchemist, such limitations do not exist, therefore the nature of the shape of the earth is not some unbreakable constant, but instead has everything to do with the perceiver's point in space and time, what kind of perceptive mechanisms they are using, and the nature of the warp bubbles and the warp bubbles within warp bubbles. This is important and it matters because such limitations also limit the possibilities for humanity, it limits their ability to travel beyond the boundaries of their staticness. For the average synergy of the world now, the only way for one to get from one object to the other is to travel in accordance with static laws. This makes it very difficult to get from one place to another, especially if those distances are vast, and do involve going from one star system to another, let us say. But there is a developing understanding of warp, and there will come a time when the seeing of inner alchemy will make more sense, as the modern world begins to understand the nature of warping. But this is a slow process, and in the meantime, we are stuck moving incredibly slowly across what we perceive to be vast distances, but what are in fact just different intensities, different gravitational waves in a way, warp bubbles within warp bubbles within warp bubbles. This is very important, this discovery by humanity of mass intensity warping, a discovery which again has been known to certain secret houses for a long time. There is a vast cosmos out there that is holding its breath hoping that humanity will be able to let go of its sticks and stones reality, and begin to see, and in their seeing discover the true nature of space and time, again. Let me repeat that, again, because this is not new knowing, it is actually very old knowing that must be rediscovered. And after doing so, after rediscovering its ancient knowing, humanity must join them, those others, out there again. But until that time, those without will wait and see because humanity must break the surface tension of the bubble, of the gravity, that contains them now within the limits of sticks and stones reality by themselves. This is the rule. If we cannot do this, if we cannot go beyond synergy and embrace a little genius, no matter how crazy it might all seem, then humanity will not be able to survive the far greater challenges to be found beyond the earth bubble. So, this is our judgment in a way, our challenge. If we cannot break free of the binding gravitational forces, the surface tension, of our current thinking, we will not escape this world and we will forever think that we are the only sentience in existence. Which, as we know even from the synergy of the times, is really a silly notion if in any way you understand the vastness of the cosmos, and are beginning to understand the potential of the human mind to change warp fields. But until sticks and stones reality is left behind by the synergy, there is no going forward. In order to understand the incredible complexity of motion, frequency, and intensity, in order to understand motion and travel from the inner alchemist's perspective, or use a kind of warping by traveling within instead of traveling without, then I recommend the books, Out-of-Body Experiences Quickly and Naturally, and The Way of the Projectionist. I will leave a link to the 3 books mentioned in the video description below.